Okay, too late now. All right, so we'll go ahead and start class. We will remember, or we'll look over the weekly question here in a second. If you're having trouble, if you haven't gotten a book yet, I don't know how to help you out with that because we've got those weekly questions due this week. But if you don't have a book yet, if you can let me know, kind of not in the chat because I'll forget, I'm not gonna lie, but maybe send me an email and say like, hey, I'm having trouble getting a book. The best I can probably do is put it off a little bit, but also you guys can do this in the chat. If some of you have a PDF version that you can share, and I might accidentally have one because someone sent it to me. I just can't really post it because it's illegal. But let me look. Let me make a note to look after class. So I'll look for PDF version of the book. And if I have it, I'll figure out a way that I can share it with you without getting fired. All right, and I think I just recorded that too, so that's not cool, is it? All right, let's start off with weekly questions. Oh, I have to let someone in. This is what happens if you come a little late. Sometimes I ignore you. Let's let them in. So, I really need a designated assistant to let people in. I've been on Zoom meetings. Oh, it's not really illegal to read the book. It's illegal to post the book if you haven't paid for the privilege of sharing it with other people. Your high school teacher, oh my gosh, they go over this a lot, and all your high school teachers ignore it. I did from time to time as well. Like they're not supposed to show movies. And I know, you know, I've been a high school teacher, every high school teacher who's ever lived, especially coaches, they show movies a lot. So you're supposed to pay for they get royalties or something. I don't know. Oops, wrong thing. Okay. Yeah. You know, those guys have to make money somehow. Poor textbook writers and movie actors and producers. All right, so was Reconstruction a failure? I think the thing we were going to go over today, because we talked about this quite a bit last time, was the end of Reconstruction, because we didn't really explain that very much. And I might mention to you a little bit more about Grant. I forgot though, and I don't mean this in a dumb way, but Grant comes up again in another chapter when they talk more about the politics of the Gilded Age, which is, so that's in 2 and 3. So, I mean, there'll be more Grant stuff, more of the corruption, because I think in this chapter it just says, hey, Grant's presidency was corrupt. And then in the next chapter, it tells you how it was corrupt. And I know you always assume because it's a politician, you know, that there's probably some corruption. Probably right. We'll just get more specific. So Reconstruction, success or failure. Don't forget to mention some land policies, key legislation, at the very least on that one, mention when they make the South into the 5 military districts, the Military Reconstruction Act or Radical Reconstruction. Southern politics, you want to talk about black codes, racial and political violence, and there are other things you could talk about. Rise of the KKK, you could talk about, oh, we already said black codes, but other restrictions on African Americans, sharecropping, which I know is a little more of an economic thing, but also the refusal to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments. And you could talk about the Supreme Court saying that enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments really is a federal thing, and on the state level, you're not really guaranteed equality. We've changed our minds about that since then, by the way. Racial and political violence, I suppose the KKK kind of needs to come up there, and Northern fatigue with Reconstruction. And that's kind of where we're headed to with the Compromise of 1877, which we'll talk about today. And then your weekly question, official one for this week, discuss the experiences of Native Americans in the Gilded Age. So the Gilded Age is the time after Reconstruction, so the time we're just about to discuss. And then it says, be sure to talk about the Dawes Act. You definitely will do that. Ghost dance, how does that reflect the experience of Indians? And what's the significance of Wounded Knee? So we'll talk about some of those things. No, or yeah, I don't know. I don't remember. That's a good question. The question is, do you just have one question due this week or two? And you know what? It's probably the other class where they have two and your class where they have one. I'm double checking the, I forget, you guys don't have the exact same schedule. Sorry. All right, let me look for the syllabus. I know it's posted on the ACC page, by the way. Yeah, I'm not trying to change. I just forgot, you know, don't get upset. You guys don't get testy with me. So yeah, I think it's just, well, hang on, I'm double checking. Sorry. Where's the 1302 syllabus? I know I wrote it. Here we go, 1302 syllabus. All right. Oh, can you see it? What I just, yeah, you can. I know you can. Why am I even asking, right? So yeah, you just, oh, it says 1 and 2, so 15 and 16. But you know, I can't remember. Is your, no, it's the last quiz that only has 3 chapters, I think. 1890, 21. Can I double check on that and send you an email? Because it looks like here that I've said you've got 2 due this week, but that your quiz is there. And I think you only have 3 chapters on the first quiz. Can't remember. Well, yeah, because you only have the 3 weekly questions. So let me double check on that and see if we really want to do the quiz the week after. I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, what a mistake. Wish I would have caught that sooner. But yeah, can I send you an email about that? But at least do the first one. I'm not going to give you a hard time if you don't do the second one. But at least do the first one. Can we go with that? And then what we'll decide is if you want the quiz next week or the week after. I honestly don't care, but the problem with it having it the week after is that's the week after we're done going over the information, but I really don't care. Doesn't matter to me at all. Yep. The last week is Find Book. Oh, last week was Find Book. Okay. And maybe I opened the different version than I posted too. Crud. I'll double check all that stuff, but at the very least, turn in the first question this week, okay? And if you turn in the second one next week, I don't care. I really don't care. I'll grade it whenever you turn it in. Don't turn it in a month though. Are we good with that? And the thing I'll double check on is the quiz. And I'll check what I posted because it looks like I saved, goodness, 2 versions of the syllabus. So I must have, I know I revised it and I don't know which one I looked at. There. I'll look at the one I posted and send you an email. So sorry for the confusion. Sorry. Okay, and let's go back to notes. How about that? All right. Oh, it said I could share multiple documents. That'd be weird. Okay. Okay. Oh, a big piece of ice in there. All right. So we talked about all kinds of stuff here. So this military or radical reconstruction, that would be the one law, of course, that you need to talk about. Of course, you should also add 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Those are kind of important. All right, Black Codes, we talked about that. Johnson, we talked about him getting impeached. He violated the Tenure of Office Act, which they passed so they could impeach him because he really hadn't done anything wrong, impeachable. So they had to pass a law to make sure they could impeach him. So that happens from time to time. Politics, you know. Now, after Johnson's presidency, I know we didn't talk about Grant very much because I guess I just didn't care. So sorry, Grant. Grant's a hugely important figure in US history, especially as a Civil War general. But, you know, as the president, he's a little iffy. Not that we don't like him personally. I'm sure he was a lovely person. He's preoccupied. He's sick. He's dying, especially in the second term. So, I mean, not that he was well in the first term. But he also has a lot of strange things to deal with. Now, the Republican Party is pretty dominant during his presidency, And there's not a whole lot of indication that he personally is a terribly dishonest fellow. He's supposed to be a nice guy. But the problem seems to be that he has several dishonest advisors, cabinet members, that kind of stuff. They'll have scandals where a bunch of Republican congressmen make a fake company and bid on contracts so they can help build parts of the Transcontinental Railroad and other railroads. So they'll bid as contractors and then subcontract to someone else. And that is illegal because they're giving themselves a contract under a fake company name. I mean, even back then when there were no laws about things that were illegal, that was illegal. There'll be his oh goodness, Belknap, he's the Grant's personal secretary, and he'll accept bribes from people. And also the Bureau of Indian Affairs will accept bribes for contracts to sell things at reservations, to buy and sell. So a whole lot of corruption going on during that time period. And it's kind of why we denigrate away from trying to enforce any sort of equality during this time period, because people start to become more concerned about how can we make money, how can we make sure our political party is in charge, rather than how can we make sure the laws are enforced, or that the Reconstruction is successful, or that African Americans have equal rights, because that's, there's not much money in that. And also, I know I mentioned this as well, the leaders who were really, excuse me for scrolling down there, the leaders who were really, really serious about Reconstruction, and those were Thaddeus Stevens, that's the guy whose name I couldn't remember last time, who was the Speaker of the House, and Charles Sumner, who is the guy that got caned, if you remember him, from 1301, who's come back, senator from Massachusetts. Of course, Lincoln was gone. And Lincoln's cabinet, after the Secretary of War was fired, which again was why they passed the Tenure of Office Act. After Lincoln's cabinet's gone and several of those older, really vigilant, radical Republicans were gone, that push in the Republican Party for equality was gone. And I know I'd mentioned to you before that the North did want to enforce equality in the South, but it's because they knew African American men would vote for Republicans, because they really didn't want African American men moving to the North. And the book does have a little section about the Kansas Exodus, or sometimes called the Exodusters. But there were certain Western states where people did give away land to African Americans, but you had to travel there and you had to have money. And one of the things I hope that you noticed in our very brief and apparently too fast at times discussion of Reconstruction was that one of the things that whites in the South made sure of is that African Americans did not have much money after Reconstruction. So, if you're a sharecropper, you're not going to make a lot of money. It's hard to make money in an agricultural society unless you own land. And there was no land redistribution after the Civil War, which is probably the only hope of economic equality for former slaves. It's probably it. So didn't happen. And so without economic equality, all the rest of the equality is kind of hard to get. It's just true. Okay. All right. And I know you're supposed to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and stuff. I know, I live in Williamson County, but if you never owned any boots, you don't have any bootstraps. If you're a former slave and your slave owner says, hey, those are my boots, you have to rent them. I don't even know if those are your bootstraps, if you know what I'm trying to say. It's an old analogy. Okay. All right. Supreme Court, yeah, it doesn't enforce. Okay, so Grant serves the 2 terms. They're marked by the corruption, the Belknap scandal, the Indian reservation scandals, and then, of course, the Credit Mobilier, which shows up in another chapter, but that's the railroads, the different congressmen making a fake holding company called Credit Mobilier, and they bid on railroad contracts that congressmen were awarding. So they awarded them to their own fake company. Yeah, they had to, they found a thing that was illegal. So there's a lot of corruption, so not a whole lot of stuff gets done. The book does mention that in the first term that Grant is going to be pretty good about sending the troops to the South when the governors ask for them on election days as part of the Force or the KKK Act. Why did that get so big? That was weird. As part of the Force Act or the KKK Act, but that federal government support for voting in the Deep South for African American men really declines in the second term, the second Grant term. Okay. Oh, well, tell Brooklyn I'm sorry. I tell you, this crazy technology. Yeah, I think maybe she just got in, but yeah. No, and I know that happens from time to time. I know, like in my house, every once in a while, the internet just goes away. I don't know why. It's the squirrels or something. I don't know. All right. So yeah, don't worry about that kind of stuff. Just come in when you can. And if you get kicked out, just come back. So, so there's an election in 1876. Now Grant serves his 2 terms. He's not going to serve a third because, well, most people didn't. There wasn't a rule yet. There'll be a rule later. And he's dying. I think I mentioned that. He had cancer. He had drank a lot in his younger days, kind of pre-Civil War days. Did you have that 8th grade teacher that talked about how Grant was a big drunk and stuff? Those are always your Civil War reenactor 8th grade teachers. I'm kidding about that, except one of the high schools I worked at, they did have a Civil War reenactor 8th grade teacher. But Grant did have a drinking problem in his early military days, apparently. I'm not so old that I knew him or anything, but I've read, you know, but he apparently got over that. And then that wasn't a problem in the Civil War. But in the Civil War, yeah, well, maybe. I don't know. I mean, it kind of depends on what sources you're reading. And there's a new, relatively new, I should say, book biography about Grant. And I was going to say that it was by, the guy that wrote 1776 and John Adams. I can't, I had this headache for like too many days. I blame Cedar, and it makes it hard for me to remember stuff. Let me look and see if I can figure out who my phone doesn't recognize my face. Let me see if I can look up who wrote the latest Grant biography. But there was a Grant biography that was written relatively recently, like the last 5 years, that kind of reasserted some stuff about him because they had, you know, different information. But for sure, he drank too much in the early part of his military career. From what I read, it's because he, you know, missed his family. He was kind of lonely. And then he smoked a lot, and he smoked cigars. And I read somewhere, sometimes it was up to 20 a day, which I can't imagine. And that has to be hard on you. But he apparently got throat cancer. So he's starting or ending that. Is that the one? Sorry, I'm talking to myself. I really thought there was a super recent one. Sorry, I know you're going like, we don't really care anyway, but you might. Yeah, I think that is the one. Ron Chernow. Let me look. Let's see if it says when it was written. Maybe not. 2017. Yeah, that's relatively. Yep, that's definitely the one. So Chernow, Chernow. I guess I could type that in there. If you want to read a more recent thing about Grant, I know because, you know, we're in Texas, you probably don't want to. At any rate, so Grant gets cancer. He knows he's going to die. He's got to take care of his family. That military pension's not going to do it. And, you know, at that time, I think presidential pension was really small still. And presidents didn't have an expense account. So they spent most of their money while they were president. Sorry, I'm saying why I put his name in there. So Grant's worried about leaving his family destitute. He doesn't want to. So he's writing his memoirs, which you could also read as you if you wanted. I wouldn't if I were you, but you can. So he's really preoccupied in the second term. I'm not saying that excuses stuff. I'm just saying, okay? Plus, the country's really moved away from, hey, let's push for equality to, hey, we're making a whole lot of money with railroads and stuff. Maybe we could make some more. And yeah, we're also, the political parties are moving away from this, I guess, structure you had toward the end of the pre-Civil War period, where the candidate seemed to be more dominant than the party, and we're about to enter an era where the party is more dominant than the candidate. You're going, does that matter? We'll later. Just hang on to that thought. Okay. So Grant's not running again. Most people don't run for 3 terms anyway. Later on, we'll pass a law so you can't. So the guys who run are Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes. And you're probably thinking, I never heard of either of them. Well, okay. Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, kind of sort of wins, but the election was disputed. We have those from time to time. And this one was disputed. There were votes in 2 or 3 different states that were called into question. Both Republicans and Democrats helped with the recount to the point where nobody was sure what the actual vote totals were. The Republicans figured out that if Grant won all 3 of the disputed states, then he would win the electoral vote, even though Tilden won the popular vote. And that's happened 4 or 5 times. It's not the most unusual thing, but our system is a little quirky in that way. Constitution sets it up that way, in case you wondered or didn't know. So the Republican Party helps with the recount. Turns out Hayes wins all 3 states magically. Then the Democrats say you cheated. There's all kinds of fights going on. The South says they're going to secede again and accuse the North of waving the bloody shirt, which they talk about in the first chapter quite a bit as well, chapter 15. You know, just reminding everybody the South started the Civil War and caused all this conflict. So you've got all this turmoil, you've got this chaos. South Carolina says, we're going to start secession again. And then everybody goes, oh my gosh, what a mess. So they decide they'll give it to the House of Representatives, who will form a committee to decide who won the election. If you're wondering how constitutional is that, I'm going to go with not very. There is certainly a part of the Constitution that says that if the election's disputed and can't be resolved in the Electoral College, that the House of Representatives should vote for the president because they're a more direct representation of the people. Goodness. But that's not exactly what the House did. They formed a committee. Turns out 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats. They decide, hey, Hayes won by a vote of 8-7, which didn't calm things down. So they decided they would make a compromise. And it's called the Bargain of 1877, sometimes called the Compromise of 1877. Foner calls it bargain. I think so. He calls it bargain. Okay. So here's what happens in that. The South gets a cabinet member, really just one. Oh my goodness, a typo. So one cabinet member, I think it's the Postmaster General. Woohoo. Okay. The South gets a railroad from Texas to California. That'll be useful, really good for commerce, that sort of thing. The North gets the presidency. And when I'm saying North and South, I really also kind of mean Democrats and Republicans. So Republican more North. Sorry for the big yawn. Democrat more South. So Republican Rutherford B. Hayes will become the president, but the South gets the big prize. That's the big one right there. That's the one they wanted, the end of military reconstruction. That means the troops are out. There's no more 5 military districts. There's no more federal government oversight in the South. The Southern states can send whoever the heck they want back to Congress. They never have to officially ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment, and the South will go back to being the South if they like, which they will. Now, if you're wondering why was the Congress willing to do this, why did everybody agree to this? Well, one, they were tired. The book calls it Northern fatigue with Reconstruction. You know, they'd worked a decade on this. We'd spent money on it. That's enough equality for us. we'll just let them figure it out from here on out. And thing number two, what was thing number two I was going to say? Why did they give up? They didn't care anymore. There was that. Yeah, they didn't care anymore. I think I was going to say something much more profound than they didn't care anymore. But the South is happy to kind of get control again. And everybody just kind of wants to go back to making money and doing what they do. So, end of military reconstruction. And the North as a whole wasn't committed to equality before this. And as I already mentioned, the leaders who were in charge had either died or retired from public life. So yeah, we're just going to go straight into the Gilded Age where lots of people, well, a handful of people will make lots of money. But the most important part of this bargain is the South getting the Northern troops out and getting to send whoever they want back to Congress. So the end of military reconstruction. Of course, that means there's not going to be any more Force Act. And I know that the book says that the Force Act really brought about the end of the KKK. I would say that they're in hibernation. That's what I would say. I don't know how much you need the KKK after no one's enforcing the laws in the South. That sounded really dumb, the way that I said that. But the purpose of the KKK, as what they said, was to restore white hegemony, and they didn't say it that way. Let me try again in a nice freshman in college sort of way. Let me try again. The purpose of the KKK was to make sure white guys were in charge in the South and black guys weren't voting. That's the general purpose. There are clearly other things that go along with that that are violent and cause African Americans to die. But that's the general, like, why the KKK rose. So they're not as necessary when the government's taking care of that. That's why there's no KKK during slavery era, because you didn't, yeah, white people in the South didn't, they controlled the government. So they're going to control the government again. The book also mentions several African Americans who rose to prominence during Reconstruction to become political leaders. We have the first couple of African American senators during that time period. And then we don't have any for a really long time. Now we have more than we had forever, I think. So, all right. Is there anything you want to ask about chapter 15 before we head into chapter 16? Anything you want to ask? I'm going to peek at the question again. Oh, yeah. When you answer that question, was Reconstruction successful or a success or failure, be sure and mention what you mean. You know, how do you define success and failure? Because nobody's going to say clearly it was successful because blacks and whites were equal at the end of the period. If you say that, you paid no attention and just dropped the class. Okay, that's too much. But yeah, that's not true. But because you did have people rise to prominence, you had the development of traditionally black colleges. You have the development of a public school system in the South, which you didn't have before, in part as a result of the Freedmen's Bureau. You have some prominent African Americans rise to some political power as well. It's not a complete failure. And those amendments, I know we don't really enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments after Reconstruction, but they're still there, and the Supreme Court will change their minds about them, and they'll get enforced later. So the legal foundation for equality, even though they don't achieve equality when they were intended to. And I would always say that the ultimate failure of Reconstruction is no money was or land was redistributed. And I know some of you are going like, dang, she's a socialist. No, no. We had hundreds of years of people being owned. They worked their entire lives and could not earn a living. So this is not socialism. You're not redistributing somebody else's money. Those folks and generations before them, everybody who came before them, had been robbed, literally robbed of the proceeds of their labor. So in that way, it only makes sense to give them money or property when the Civil War ends. Now, of course, the plantation owners did not agree, and neither did the Republicans in charge. So that's the thing you hear about sometimes when you hear about reparations. which is a whole other subject and controversial, but it shouldn't have been controversial, say, in the 1860s and 70s. Now, all right, enough of that. All right, I'm going to check something and also see. You guys have any questions? Everybody good? Did we kick anybody out? You're all still here? All right, okay. All right, you guys in the chat can tell each other what you're eating for lunch, and I'll go back to sharing the screen. That's what we had in my morning class. Everybody was sharing what they were eating for breakfast. So, thanks for saying you're good. All right, we will share the notes again. Weekly question, lecture notes. Just making sure I don't open your quiz. That would be a little too much information, wouldn't it? All right, so, oh yeah, the weekly question for this one really is kind of second half of the chapter, but we'll get there to some of it, I think. Yeah, we will. Okay. All right, the first part is the all-American part, rich guys. I know it's all American, don't give me a hard time. I know you wouldn't mind seeing the quiz. So, a Gilded Age. That term was coined by the very famous, most important writer in American history, Mark Twain. Why do I say that? Because he's from the great state of, yes, my home state, Missouri. We're very proud. So, but gilded means coated in gold. And gilded is like, I almost always have some jewelry that's like that. No, not today. But gilded is where it's gold on the surface, but underneath it's not so much. So guys, at the beginning of class, remember I told you I know for sure that question 1's due this week, but I'll double check on the syllabus because I think I may have made an error on the syllabus. At the very least, all of you need to turn in question 1 for this week. Question 2, I honestly don't care if you turn it in this week or next week. I think the big question we have to solve, and I said I'd send you an email, the big question we have to solve is, when is the quiz? Is it next week or the week after? Okay, that's the big question to solve. I won't care if you turn in 2 questions this week, 1 question this week, 1 next week. I won't care. Okay. Okay, just turn them in. Okay. All right. No, you're completely fine. And I was confused about this because I think I made a mistake on the syllabus I posted. So sorry. Yep. No, and I was more given like, because they were trying to answer and I think people didn't remember. But you guys are good. Don't worry. Don't worry. And I'll send an email. So it'll be completely clear. It'll be right there in words. And you can say like, Ms. Cerna, you sent this email. Okay. Back to Mark Twain. Oh my gosh, you distracted me from the great American from the state of Missouri. Gilded meant coated in gold. So it looks good on the surface, but underneath, not so good. It's like, yeah, this watch. You see my very fancy, isn't that lovely? Very fancy watch. It's silver, but I think it's silver tone because on the side, it's not silver anymore. So when you have relatively inexpensive, we'll say practical jewelry, and the silver or gold tone rubs off, that means it was gilded. It's fake. It only looks good on the surface. It's like older people when they get Botox on their face and their face looks good for a while, and then 3 weeks later, the wrinkles come back. That's why I just go natural. It's like I'm old. I should have wrinkles. But anyway, so it's something that looks better than it really is. So the Gilded Age looks better than it really is, perhaps. And we really struggle historically with whether this is filled with robber barons or if it's filled with captains of industry. Are these guys like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and whoever else? There we are, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, all the other dudes. Edison, although Edison's kind of in a different category. Ford, he kind of shows up at the end, but there's a handful of them, I should say. Are these guys taking advantage of their poor workers and gaining large amounts of wealth? Are they creating wealth that had never happened before and making sure everyone gets more prosperous? What is going on? Is it really a prosperous era? Does it just look like a prosperous era? Are these guys great guys? Are they instead terrible guys? Who knows? You get to decide if they're great or terrible. Your decision. But here's some things we do know for sure. More people moved to the cities during this time period. By the end of this era, half the population is urban, half is rural, and that had never happened before in our country. To this point in our country, we'd been a largely rural country. So more people lived in the country, agriculturally based economy, that sort of thing. So we're moving also away from an agriculturally based economy to a more business-based economy. And not all the businesses were dependent on agriculture. Some of them were, some of them weren't, okay? So it's also the first time more people work for wages than not. So that means you get paid by the hour or the week, probably by the week during this time period. Day or hour, it says day or hour. So I guess day is kind of like week. But they would say like, hey, if you work all day, I'll pay you $5. But then, you know, all day could be 16 hours. There's also no minimum wage yet. We'll talk about that later. So this is, by the end of this period, it completes the population shift from rural to urban. Okay. So it also, I didn't put this in the notes, but this is true and important. It also makes the United States a world power. Now, we'd been cool before this. Don't be upset. We were cool before this, but we really weren't a world power economically or militarily because we didn't have as much money as other countries. We were doing pretty well. You know, there's more of a chance that you could own land in the United States. There's more opportunity here than a lot of other places, but the country itself was not really wealthy. After this time period, because the business side of the country expands so much, we are going to have a ridiculous amount of money, a ridiculous amount of money. And if you're a country and you have a ridiculous amount of money, I don't know, if you're a teenager and you have a ridiculous amount of money, what do? You can answer this if you want or not. In my era, you bought a fancy car or you bought a really loud stereo system for your fancy car. That's what kids with money did. If you're a country, you make a big military. So we didn't have a big military before. There'll be some guy, this Alfred Thayer Mahan guy, who says, hey, if you want to be a world power, then you have to have a big navy. So we'll build a navy. And did we have a navy before? You're asking yourself, did we have a navy before? Kind of, sort of, maybe not so much. It was small because, you know, we had an ocean on either side and that tended to keep us pretty safe. But in this era, you know, the travel across the Atlantic, especially Pacific too, but there's more people going across the Atlantic much faster. So the ocean on either side thing is not going to be quite as protective as it had been before. I know it still keeps us out of World War I and II for a little while, but it doesn't mean people can't reach us. You're also going to have an enormous amount of immigration or number of immigrants during this time period. All right. Are you done listening to me talk about what's going to happen in this period? Let me just tell you about the rich guys. You know about the rich guys. You all want to be rich guys when you grow up. So I never taught a high school student that thought they were going to grow up and be poor. They all seemed to think they were going to be millionaires. I hope that worked out for some of them, and I hope it works out for you. For these four guys, it absolutely worked out. Okay. Vanderbilt is the oldest of this group. He was born pre-Civil War. I guess they all were, but he had a son who fought in the Civil War. It was his favorite son. He had a bunch of kids, 12 or 13, like 10 daughters, 2 or 3 boys. His favorite one died in the Civil War, and he was a jerk to all the other kids. He's kind of a jerk if you read about him, but he does make a lot of money. I'm not saying that excuses you being a jerk. We read about him. I mean, people don't make history because they're jerks or nice people. They make history, I mean, they are jerks or nice people, there's no doubt, but they don't make history because of that. They make history in spite of that, or they make history because of what is accomplished or what horrible thing they did, something like that. Or timing, who knows. But Vanderbilt runs a shipping company, and this is steamship. He didn't want to go to school. So I think when he was 12, his parents, who were fairly middle class-ish, said, hey, buddy, Cornelius, if you don't want to go to school, then you have to work here, we'll buy you one steamship or small boat. So he ran a steam line in the New York area for transportation and stuff. I know sometimes rich guys are jerks, but poor guys can be too. I'm not saying, that I've, it's probably easier to get away with it if you're rich. I don't know. But anyway, Vanderbilt um, makes decent living from his little shipping thing and then starts to expand throughout the country. He even runs shipping lines across South America and starts to get shipping contracts for the Civil War, helps to put up telegraph lines during the Civil War, and then starts investing in railroads. So he makes money from shipping on actual ships and railroads. And that's really where the money comes from, railroads. Yeah, a lot of money. His railroad, the New York Central Railroad, eventually will become, I think is what the basis of the subway system. And he builds the Grand Central Station. Well, his family does. He doesn't, because he can't live forever, right? He makes a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. He passes it along mostly to his one son, William, who he doesn't think is very cool and makes fun of, but he's better than his other son who has epilepsy, who he really makes fun of. And then he doesn't like any of his daughters. He's a cool guy. When he and his wife lived on, I think, in Manhattan, and he wanted to move to downtown New York, and she said she didn't want to go. So he said, if you don't go, I will put you in a mental institution. Hey, somebody's asking a question. You want to say it or type it or what's going on? Or did you accidentally ask a question? I'll keep going. But if you want to ask a question, just say something or type it in the chat. I think it'll show up. So Vanderbilt, kind of mean to his wife, really mean to his kids. Then his wife dies and he gets all sad and lonely and decides to remarry. And it's really hard for cranky old rich guys to get married or not. But he ends up marrying his cousin, it's a different time period. He marries his cousin Francesca from the South. And Francesca says, hey, all the other rich guys are much more charitable than you are. You should give away some of your money. So yeah, he's really fun. Of course, you're also getting my impression of him, but I've never read anybody who said, no, he's a really nice guy, but he's really good at making money. And his son is even better. So his son does, lots more investment and really kind of builds up the railroad. And then that next generation spends all the money and bankrupts a lot of it, the different family branches. But Vanderbilt, before he dies, becomes more charitable because his wife told him, you look like a jerk. All the other rich guys are charitable. But he spends most of his money on endowing a university, which is Vanderbilt University. And I think they still have some money. So I think you could go there. And the third generation of his family has like a big house building contest where they try to build the fanciest houses in the New York area. Although I think there's one in South Carolina as well. But they do that in the 1920s. And then, you've probably heard something bad happens in 29. So the family goes broke-ish. Leftover Vanderbilts, I guess the most famous leftover one is Anderson Cooper. Maybe you've heard of him. He's an older guy, white-haired dude on CNN. Have you heard of him? Okay. But he's the last, I think, famous-ish Vanderbilt who's left. And they don't have like so much money that they don't have to work, but they have enough money that they could still go to Vanderbilt or some other nice college. All right. So that family, New York Central Railroad, builds Grand Central Station, lots of money in the New York area, major charity, Vanderbilt University, and really expands transportation, especially of goods. The people didn't travel so much then, but you sent goods, shipping by railroad. So it's an important thing. And he may or may not be a nice guy. I don't know. There's a series about this, one of those PBS American Experience series. It's called Men Who Built America. Yeah, Men Who Built America. It's really good. It's kind of soap opera-like, but written by historians as well, so it's fairly accurate. It's pretty entertaining stuff. You could find it on YouTube in your free time. You could watch it. I know you have a lot of free time. If I think about it, I'll write that next to you. Okay, so when is quiz? And I'll write link to Men Who Built America. It's really a pretty cool series, I think. And it kind of shows the good and the bad about them, but dang, the amount of money they made really changes our country. For the better or worse, probably both, but it does make us a world power, which we probably appreciate sometimes. I don't know. Rockefeller, he's a little more of a middle class-ish kind of dude. Seems like he's from Chicago area. Yeah, I think so. So he's Midwestern. His dad sells, we'll say medicine, but it's mostly like alcohol and cocaine and stuff like that, which was okay to use as medicine during that time period. We'll decide later on it's better to use other things. But Rockefeller's a little embarrassed of his upbringing because his dad's a little bit of a, I don't know, he's not, we'll say he's not a regular family provider kind of person. And you see that with Carnegie as well. But Carnegie's dad doesn't do anything that's a little shifty. He just does something that's not very effective. So Rockefeller, he really likes chemistry, and he's a pretty precise kind of dude. He invests his money in oil production. It seems like at first, I want to say he did coal at first, but what he figures out pretty quickly is, when they're finding this oil, when they're looking for coal, they know it's probably good for something. They just don't know what it's really good for. So they figure out fairly quickly that it'd be good for lighting things and heating houses. But this kerosene and lamp oil and stuff that they used in the early days, it was pretty useful, except occasionally it would just explode. And the problem apparently was, at least this is what Rockefeller decided, is that when they were producing the kerosene, that they weren't very careful about it. So he decided to build a factory in a very precise way that was very controlled, with a very precise chemical formula for the oil that he was producing, so it would be safe, and so it would have a certain standard. So he called his company Standard Oil. Yes, Standard Oil. And the reason that it really caught on is because it didn't explode in your house. Now, that's pretty cool if you can heat up your house and not blow it up, or if you can light up your house and not blow it up. So people went, hey, we like this stuff. And it really caught on because it was a very good, safe, consistent product. And that's why, chemistry matters. It does, it does. My brother's an organic chemist. He makes cheese starter. And, your cheese won't be good if my brother's not doing his job. Chemistry, it really matters. Okay, this is probably more important than cheese even, though you don't want your house to explode. Now, Rockefeller, also super devout Baptist kind of dude. So every Sunday, he donates 10% of his income to his church. So somewhere in Illinois or New York, because he does live in New York for a while too, there's a very wealthy Baptist church somewhere. He was a pretty charitable dude as well. He donated a ridiculous amount of money to the University of Chicago, to his church, and to the Rockefeller Foundation, which you've perhaps heard of. All right. Carnegie's the steel guy. Before he was the steel guy, where did he work? Railroad company. Yeah. His family emigrated to the United States when he was about 12. His dad was a weaver. You go like, weaver? What's a weaver? They made cloth. So his dad made cloth by hand. He used a loom. And that was kind of going out of style. So, because people were starting to buy pre-manufactured cloth, so his dad couldn't make a living. So he went and worked at a textile mill, and then eventually, I think, did the telegraph messages for that mill, and then eventually worked in the accounting department where he made money and then figured out you could invest money. And so he started investing money and then took the money from his investments and bought a railroad company and then used that money to buy an oil company, or excuse me, a steel company, which will eventually become Carnegie Steel. And his steel company will eventually become US Steel once JP Morgan, the next guy, consolidates some other companies and puts it together. Both Carnegie and Rockefeller at certain points, and Morgan, I think too. I suppose Vanderbilt must have been as well. So all four of these guys at some point in their existence were the richest guy in, at least in the United States. For a couple of them, I'm pretty sure it's the world. So Rockefeller, Standard Oil, controlled 85 to 90% of the oil market worldwide eventually, and Carnegie about 90% of the worldwide steel market for quite a long time. So lots of money between these guys. Carnegie's super charitable guy, but also controversial because if you worked for him, he didn't pay you very well. And these companies were pretty notorious if you went on strike for hiring private armies to come put down the strike. So they would come and shoot at you or burn up your little camp or something like that. And they would kill people in the process. And that was all legal back in these days because people hadn't done stuff like this yet. So we didn't have laws that said you can't do it yet. So this is the era that creates a lot of the laws we'll have in the era after, because there'll be some shifty things that go on during this time period. Okay. Carnegie, major charities, Carnegie Foundation, which is a multi-billion-dollar foundation even to this day. And they fund primarily libraries, but also performing arts. You've probably heard of Carnegie Hall, education, that sort of stuff. There's a lot of Carnegie fellowships. And then Carnegie Mellon University. Carnegie was you know who, and Mellon was Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of the Treasury for quite a while in the United States. So that's it's a good combo there for money. He wrote a book and an essay as well called The Gospel of Wealth. And I think your chapter has excerpts of it. I don't know. I think so. Excuse me. Sorry. So thirsty. It's water. It's good. Good. Legit. Now Coke Zero because I need caffeine. But Carnegie wrote The Gospel of Wealth. And what he said, this is kind of interesting, and you should do this maybe. It's up to you if you ever get wealthy. He says that wealthy dudes not spend all their money. You shouldn't be all flashy, and you shouldn't have like 3 kids and spoil them ridiculously. You should leave your kids a decent amount of money, but you need them to have to work. Otherwise, they'll be lazy, horrible people. It's kind of what he said. It's not exactly how he said it. But he also said, you need to give all your money away before you go, because there's no reason for you to have that much money if you're super wealthy. So Bill Gates kind of does the same thing. Michael Dell probably does in his own way too. They give away lots of money. All the other rich guys probably do too. I don't know. But, those are just the 2 I can think of. But Carnegie says you need to give it away while you're alive. And because that way you have control over where your money goes. So leave your kids enough that they're comfortable, but not lazy and spoiled and terrible. And give away the bulk of your fortune. And if you need to create a foundation, just make sure you decide what that foundation does, which is what he did. And lots of rich guys kind of follow that model. Maybe that guy that owns the Dallas Mavericks is like that a little. I don't know. I see him on TV from time to time. All right. If I'm ever wealthy, I'd probably do that. I don't know. The history money is really good. All right, JP Morgan, you're going to like him the most probably because he doesn't really make anything. He's a finance guy, and he probably ends up with more money than all these guys, making money off of their money. His dad was a pretty successful banker. So much so, like if you watch the show, Men Who Built America, you will notice his dad makes fun of him all the time, says, you'll never be as cool as me. You'll never be as successful as me. That's cool in a dad, isn't it? Dad, what are you thinking? Mr. Morgan, not cool. But he ends up being incredibly successful, much, larger banker than even his father. He helps consolidate the railroad industry at first, and they pay him substantially to do that. So he will invest his money pretty consistently. He's the one who buys Carnegie Steel and combines it with other companies to create US Steel. And then, of course, we'll sell it. So he is primarily about investing and making money off investments. So he's a banker and a financier. His major charities are local to New York, so museums, art galleries, local city charities, and Harvard Medical School. He donated a lot of money, which I think their endowments are like 4 or 5 billion. They have a lot of money. But JP Morgan's company turned into JP Morgan Chase Bank, which is one of the largest banks, international banks in the world. So there's still a ton of Morgan money. And when we have a recession and then a depression in 1893, the government runs out of money and borrows from him. So, you know, he's got more money than the United States. Although I suppose technically all of us have more money than the United States right now, since they're in debt. Even if you're in debt, you're not like $20 trillion in debt. So we're, yeah. But this is in an era where countries weren't in debt. So, yeah. What else do I want to say about JP Morgan? Lots of people who work for him also become very successful. The one I can always remember is that Charles Schwab fellow, who was one of his accountants. And then that guy eventually becomes pretty successful and has an investment firm that is still quite successful. So these guys make a lot of money. There are other guys in that era that make a lot of money as well, but shoot, these guys, goodness, it's crazy how much money they make. Now, are they good guys, bad guys? Up to you, I don't care. However, people who work for them aren't always thrilled, you know? So lots of people go on strike, and the book will talk pretty extensively about some of the strikes that happen, how they treat their workers. And again, this is an era where there's no minimum wage. So these guys don't pay their workers well, and they don't have to. The first kind of wealthy guy who starts to pay his workers reasonable wages because he just thinks it's a good idea is Henry Ford. Now, don't get all happy about Henry Ford, because you're going to find out some stuff about him that makes him not so cool either. But as far as working for him, well, not everything about working for him was good. But he'll be the first guy that starts to pay decent wages. But that's in the 1900s. So in the 1800s, there's very few employers you could look at and go like, hey, that guy's really nice and charitable. Okay. All right, so this is not a good era for workers. Do you guys have any questions? Are you good? Want to ask anything? I'm gonna hang on one second. Sorry, it's really warm in my house, so I have a little heater on at my feet, and it's not warm anymore. Well, it was really cold. Now it's warm. So, all right, working. This is a bad time to not be a rich guy, but you're going like, when is a good time not to be a rich guy? Now is okay. I mean, I'm not a rich guy, but I got a fancy house with cereal boxes and a little heater at my feet. I live a good life, and all I do is talk about history. So I don't know. It's always tough to be poor, but this is an era where there are very few legal protections for the poor, and there's very few there's very little government assistance for the poor, is what I'm trying to say. I would never make fun of being poor. I have been poor before, and I don't mean like I had to eat ramen in college poor, but another sort of, I grew up in the Ozarks poor, and my dad used to eat squirrels for dinner. And yeah, it's not cool. So I'm not trying to romanticize it at all. It's really not cool. But this era, dang. Okay. So what you notice, and you'll read about this in the textbook, is not only is there no minimum wage, there's no safety rules about your workplace. So what happens if you go to work and get hurt? You get fired because you can't do your job anymore. And they don't have to pay for you to get well. They don't have to pay for medical care, which might not be good during this time period anyway. They don't have to give you money because you got hurt and can't ever work again. So you're just even more broke than you were before you got hurt at work. And if they don't like you, they can fire you for any reason. There's just no worker protection. So no minimum wage, it's unsafe, and they can fire you whenever they feel like it for no reason. Sound like a fun time? Um, it's terrible. And workplaces, especially steel production workplaces, and this is mostly steel, but like if you work in a meat packing plant, that's going to be gross. Even textile mills, you can get your fingers and toes kind of chopped off in the looms, especially like they had a lot of little shoeless kids working on the looms, and they did lose toes from, time to time. It was not uncommon. So a tough time period. It really is. Even though there's a fabulous amount of wealth that's created, the gap between rich and poor is the largest that it ever is in our history. And I know there's just something that came out yesterday that said it's the highest that it's been in, I don't know, a long time, but the long time really is like 9 or 10 years. This is a whole different, I mean, not that that's good, but this is really bad. If you want to read about how bad it is, here are two books you could read. And yes, you could do these for the book review if you wanted. Sunshine and Shadow in New York, which is the book that Foner talks the most about. And Foner was a resident historian at Columbia University, which is in that area. So he really likes local history as well. I mean, he's a really solid Civil War historian and others. He's a very good historian. But he's really more partial to New York local history than you would guess, maybe because of where he lived. And the book that I've read, I haven't read Sunshine and Shadow. Maybe I should do that. I've read How the Other Half Lives, because that is talked about a lot as well. And that's an interesting book to me. It's not an interesting book at all. Okay, I would be lying if I told you that's a really fun book to read. I didn't think so. I thought it was terrible, but it's important. It has diagrams of people's apartments. It has pictures of the apartments from the time period. And what Jacob Riis does, and Matthew Smith does something in a probably slightly more acceptable way, but Riis does something that reflects a lot of the thoughts of his time period. He goes from ethnic neighborhood to ethnic neighborhood, talking about what's good and what's bad about the neighborhood, and in the process shows how difficult the living and working conditions are. It's part of what he's trying to do, but he's also trying to tell you which immigrants make the most of their opportunities. And in that retelling, he also reveals the acceptable prejudices of the time period. He will use ethnic slurs you've probably never heard. So you go like, what is that? Yeah, if you ever read that and there's a word he calls people and you don't recognize it, I'm just going to tell you don't call people whatever he said. It's probably bad. So yeah, but it's an interesting book. Historically, it's not like a fun book. And I think the Sunshine and Shadow book has a lot more photographs in it, but I think so. There's also somebody who chronicles what it's like for children in the workplace, but I think that shows up a little bit more in the progressive era chapter, so we'll save that for later. All right, so more people move to the city. There's a handful of people that make a ridiculous amount of money. The statement here is kind of interesting. Top 1% in the country earn the same as the bottom 50%. So the difference between rich and poor is just really dramatic during this time period. More people live in the city, the workplace is developing, workers' rights are developing. You'll see early labor unions during this time period. I think the next chapter talks about them more, and they're not terribly successful. If you're looking for successful workers' strikes during this time period, they're so rare. They really are. The one that always sticks out to me is there's a union of ladies garment workers, some women who are tailors, and they hand sew suits for a company called Hart, Schaffner, and Marks, which is still around. They have a store somewhere in Austin, like a fancy part of Austin, I think off of 38th Street. And you probably don't have any clothes from them. Well, one, they only make guys' clothes. I'm not saying if you're, you can all wear guys' clothes. But the other thing is they make suits that probably start at about $1,000. And most people your age are not going to spend that much on a suit because you're still growing. I mean, when you're older and you're not going to grow anymore, and you're really fancy, maybe you'll spend $1,000 on a suit. I wouldn't, but who knows? I didn't spend that much on my wedding dress, but maybe you will. But even then, their suits were really expensive, like 150, $200, which is probably half a year's wage for a lot of people. So these women did the hand-tailored suits and they didn't make very much money. So they told their bosses at Hart, Schaffner, and Marx, like, hey, you should pay us more. And they went, hey, we're not going to. And they said, hey, we're going to stop working then. And they said, whatever, we can replace you in right away. And you can't really replace somebody that hand tailors a suit. And they figured that out. So within 2 weeks, the strike was ended and they got everything they asked for. And I think the moral of that story, if there is one, there probably is that if you have an unusual skill, you can probably demand higher wages. Now, all these factory workers who ran machines and stuff, yeah, that didn't work out too well for them. And also bosses who ran the factories, especially the management class, really understood prejudice very well during that time period. And you're asking, like, does that really matter? Like, if you want to be a jerk, it does. So if you knew that this newest group of Italian immigrants was really hated by the previous group of Irish immigrants, then maybe you would hire an equal number of Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants. So rather than forming a union, they'd fight with each other. And that's the kind of thing that management class did during this time period. They hired people to work in their factories that either they knew hated each other so that they wouldn't work together to form unions, or were such recent immigrants that they were so desperate for work and money that they would never ask for anything extra, So, and if you hired the most desperate person, since there's no minimum wage, you could pay them even less than you paid the people before. So wages didn't necessarily rise during this era because immigration is pretty constant in this era. It's also why groups hated the newest group of immigrants, because they brought down wages. And again, I'm not justifying it. Don't say like Cerny said it was okay to hate immigrants because they bring down wages. I did not say that. No, I did not say that. But I am saying that that was common during this era. Oh, sorry for the yawn. Okay. Now, I'll do the little preview of why people go west, because I know it's almost time to go and you're going like, no, it was time like 20 minutes ago. Don't be rude. Don't be like that. Okay, here's why people go west, because I don't know. The weather's better. I do know. 3 main reasons: farming, ranching, and mining. Did I say ranching like I was from the South almost? Ranching. Farming, ranching, and mining. And so farming, that's usually you and your family go west and you get some land. Ranching, that's probably dudes. And mining, that's definitely dudes. Now, sometimes women went for ranching and mining as well. They typically weren't ranchers or miners. Sometimes they were, they typically weren't. They did laundry, or we'll say entertainment. We'll go with that, okay? All right, so farming, that's mostly people kind of Ohio Valley going a little farther west, or maybe all the way to the coast, especially Washington, Oregon, and California. The ranching is a little more southwest, but sometimes northern Great Plains. And then mining, you gotta have some mountains. You have to have something to mine. So Colorado, California, I don't know where else I should know the answer. I mean, there's some smaller mining areas, and of course, Alaska eventually. Yeah, eventually. Toward the end of the century, like 1890s. Yeah. All right. I don't want to get too much into the farming, ranching, and mining because I don't want you to like forget it. But just your general overview: farming, mostly families. Most of the people who end up going west to farm don't farm because it's harder to farm in the West. And even if they went to like Great Plains, which is the most productive farmland in the world now, it wasn't then because no one had plowed it up yet. So it was where the buffalo roamed. So there were also some Native Americans there who weren't always excited to see new farmers and ranchers. So that was a little tricky. The ranching, you live in Texas, so you're probably a little familiar with this, although I know we don't all own ranches and oil wells. But the western part of our state has a few of these. I suppose the eastern and the northern part do too, maybe the south. But ranching, you're raising cattle and then you're sending the cattle to market, or you're the cattle and sending what's left of them to market so people can eat. One of the things you'll notice is that if you're farming or ranching, for whatever reason, someone in the United States decided 160 acres was what you needed. So that is the standard size plot, and you get more land if you had more people in your family or if you bought the neighbor's ranch or farm. Most people who went to ranch or to farm weren't terribly successful because the 160 acres isn't enough. The ranching, kind of the same thing, but there were probably more ways around that, so you could buy more than one plot. And then the mining, dang, as an independent miner, M-I-N-E-R, not like somebody under 18, but a guy looking for gold, silver, or whatever else you're mining for. Oh, the Dakotas, I forgot the Dakotas, what the heck. And that's not really AL, it's AK, it's Alaska. Sorry for the bad abbreviation there. The mining is really much more successful in the corporate end. Individual miners might make a little bit of money, but then typically a corporation would go and buy the land where they found the gold, silver, whatever they found. And then of course, the last part of the chapter was how well received the ranchers, farmers, and miners were by the Native Americans who lived there. And then at the very end, dang, there's a little bit about politics. And we'll talk more about those things next time. Now, the weekly question, which I'm sorry, I don't remember if it's due this week or next week. But again, I already told you, you just at least turn one in this week. And I'll double check on the quiz date and I'll send you an email. But the weekly question from this chapter is about Native Americans. So we'll hit that kind of hard next time. All right, before you guys log off and say like, I'm done and I got to go eat lunch. Do you have any questions? And hang on 1 second before you all go, because I just want to double check the roll. Go ahead and stop.